Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 29, verse 11, which reads, "A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back." Now, the reason I wanted to take a look at this verse in particular is because I feel like we live in a cultural moment right now that has elevated emotional expression to something close to a moral virtue. Like, authenticity, as we are told, means saying what you feel when you feel it, and that holding back is repression, and that filtering yourself is dishonesty, and that the person who says exactly what is on their mind at any given moment is celebrated as real and unafraid, while the person who pauses before speaking is sometimes viewed with suspicion, as though the pause indicates something being hidden rather than something being considered. But look, Proverbs 29:11 does not agree with that framework. It does not say the wise person suppresses everything they feel and becomes emotionally unavailable necessarily, but it does say that giving full vent to everything in your spirit is the behavior of a fool, while the wise person quietly holds it back. And so the restraint is not the problem, but the unrestrained venting is. This verse also arrives in the context of Proverbs 29 having a great deal to say about anger and its management. You know, verse 8 says, "Scoffers set a city aflame, but wise men turn away wrath." Verse 9 describes the futility of arguing with a fool. Verse 22 will say that a man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes much transgression. And so we see the chapter is just building a picture of what uncontrolled emotional expression does to the social fabric around it. And obviously verse 11 is the most direct and most personal statement of the principle underlying all of these observations. So that being said, let's just break down the verse. First part says, "A fool gives full vent to his spirit." Now, for context, the phrase full vent is the key image of the first half, and I think it is more vivid in the original than the English translation suggests. The Hebrew word translated as gives full vent describes the sending out of everything, right? The total release of what is inside without retention or restraint. It is the image of a container that has been completely emptied and nothing held back, everything that was inside now outside. And applied to the spirit or inner life, this describes a person who has no internal governor between what they feel and what they express, right? Whatever is happening on the inside comes out immediately, completely, and without any filtering process between the emotion and its expression, right? The fool does not ask whether this is the right moment to say this. You know, they do not ask whether the full content of what they are feeling is actually relevant or helpful to the situation. They just simply vents, and everything comes out. The word spirit, which is ruach in Hebrew, here encompasses the full range of inner emotional and psychological experience. It is the breath and the inner life together, right? The animating interior reality of a person. And so giving full vent to the spirit, or ruach, means releasing the complete unedited contents of that interior reality into the relational and social environment without constraint. And I think that this is where the verse needs its most important clarification, because, you know, it can be misread as a wholesale condemnation of emotional expression, but that reading would create a direct contradiction with the Psalms, where David gives full expression to grief, anger, confusion, and despair before God with a sort of rawness that is sometimes startling. You know, Jesus himself expressed strong emotion at multiple points in the Gospels, most vividly in his weeping at the tomb of Lazarus and his anger at the temple. So this verse is not condemning emotional depth or honest expression of what we feel, you know, but I think what it is condemning is the specific pattern of unfiltered, unrestrained venting of everything in the spirit into whatever context happens to be present when the feeling arrives, right? The fool's problem is not that they feel strongly, but it is that they have no mechanism between the feeling and its full public expression, right? There is no pause, no consideration, no filtering of what is appropriate to the moment. the relationship, or the purpose of the conversation, because everything comes out because everything comes out because everything always comes out, right? And even Proverbs 12:16 earlier in this book makes I think it makes the contrast explicit in slightly different language. It says, "The vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult." Right? Known at once is the full venting of Proverbs 29:11. The fool's emotional state is immediately visible because they have already expressed it before any other response was possible. Right? The prudent person who ignores the insult is not unaffected by it. They have simply introduced the pause that Proverbs 29:11 identifies as the mark of wisdom. Even in James 1:19-20 in the New Testament, which has appeared multiple times in this series because it is consistently relevant, it gives a great framework for this idea. It says, "Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Right? The anger of man not producing the righteousness of God is the theological reason behind the practical instruction to be slow to anger. Right? Full venting of the Spirit feels like it is making a righteous point, but it almost never is. Rather, it is producing the strife of Proverbs that we see back in Proverbs 15:18, rather than the righteousness the person believes they are demonstrating. Even, in Ecclesiastes 10:4, it adds a dimension that I think is particularly relevant in context involving authority or power. It says, "If the anger of the ruler rises against you, you do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest." Right? The calmness is the held back response of the wise person in Proverbs 29:11, and it lays great offenses to rest, which is the functional opposite of what full venting produces. Right? The fool's full vent escalates, the wise person's quiet restraint de-escalates, but the outcomes are consistent and measurable. The second half of the verse says, "But a quiet man..." Oh, I botched that. Excuse me. It says, "But a wise man quietly holds it back." And I think this introduces the contrasting behavior with a word that is worth examining closely, because quietly describes the manner of the holding back, and it is a detail that the verse did not have to include, right? Solomon actually could have simply said the wise man holds it back, but he specifies the quality of that restraint. It's quiet. And I think this quietness is not the seething restraint of someone who is holding everything in while internally boiling over, the kind of suppression that accumulates and eventually produces an even more explosive expression, because that would be more suppression, not the wise holding back that Solomon is describing. The quietness suggests something more settled, more grounded, a restraint that comes from a place of inner stability rather than effortful self-control that is barely holding the lid on. Okay, bear with me here. Holds it back. It is translated as Yeshabekshena, something like that. I can't read it that well. It's probably because I'm not that smart. But anyways, that term uses a Hebrew word that means to calm, to still, or to bring us to a state of rest. And it is actually the same term used in Psalm 65:7 when God stills the roaring of the seas. Right? The wise person does not merely prevent the Spirit from venting, but they bring it to a place of rest. They still it. And this is an active inner work, not a passive suppression that results in a genuinely quieter inner state from which the restrained external response flows naturally. Right? Like, this distinction here between suppression and genuine stilling is, I think, one of the most practically important things that this verse is communicating. The goal is not learning to mask what you feel while continuing to feel it at full intensity, but the goal is a kind of inner formation that brings the Spirit to a settled place before the response happens. And I think that formation is developed through the practices of prayer, reflection, and the cultivation of genuine inner peace that comes from the foundational posture of the fear of the Lord that we established all the way back in Proverbs 1:7. And Proverbs 16:32 even frames this restraint as a form of genuine strength, and I think it is worth repeating here because it directly addresses the cultural assumption that restraint is weakness. It says, "Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." So, right, rules his spirit basically is the holding back of Proverbs 29:11, and the comparison to taking a city is not casual. But in Solomon's world, military conquest was the highest expression of power available. Ruling your own spirit is presented as a greater accomplishment than that. The person who quietly holds back is not demonstrating weakness, but they are exercising the most demanding form of strength available to a human being, right? And so, let's just give a practical application here, right? Because, again, as I always say in my videos, I truly believe that being able to turn knowledge into action is one of the most important parts of our Christian walk. And so the first thing that I have is to identify the specific triggers that most reliably produce full venting in us. I feel like the most practically useful response to this verse is the honest identification of the categories of situation, relationship, or provocation that most consistently produce the fool's pattern in us. Because most of us, if we're being honest, do not give full vent to everything in every situation, but most of us have specific triggers where the distance between feeling and expression collapses. I think a particular kind of criticism that bypasses our normal restraint, right? Like a specific person, for example, whose words reliably produce an immediate, unfiltered response. A category of situation where the full vent happens before we have made any conscious decision to speak. And I think naming those specific triggers honestly is the first step toward the wise person's alternative, because you cannot introduce a pause into a reaction you have not yet even recognized as a pattern. The second thing is to develop the specific practice of the pause as a discipline rather than waiting for it to feel natural. Right? Like the wise person's quiet holding back does not appear overnight, but it is developed through the consistent practice of introducing a pause between provocation and response in moments when the pause is seriously difficult. And this might look like the simple physical discipline of not responding immediately to a message, an email, or a situation that has produced a strong emotional reaction, right? It might look like the specific practice of prayer before a conversation or context that it is likely to provoke, and it might even look like the habit of asking one question before responding in a tense situation, which naturally introduces enough delay that the full vent is disrupted. But none of these are sophisticated techniques, though, right? They're the simple mechanics of just building the space between feeling and expression that the wise person uses and the fool never does. And then the third thing is to just pursue the inner formation that makes restraint quiet rather than effortful. Because, I just think the deepest application of this verse is the one that addresses not just the behavior, but the inner state from which the behavior flows. The quietly of the verse points toward a kind of settled inner peace that does not require heroic willpower necessarily to maintain restraint, because the spirit has been genuinely brought to rest rather than merely suppressed. And I think that inner state is the product of genuine spiritual formation over time, right? The kind that flows from the fear of the Lord, from regular prayer and scripture engagement, and from the cultivation of genuine humility that does not need to defend itself at every point of challenge. Even Philippians 4:6-7 describes the inner state that makes quiet restraint possible. It says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." And so I think that peace that just guards the heart and mind is the inner condition from which the wise person's quiet holding back flows naturally. It is the fruit of a sustained relationship with God, not a technique deployed in difficult moments. Right? Proverbs 29:11 is a verse that our current cultural moment needs more than most. The celebration of unfiltered self-expression as a virtue, the equation of restraint with repression, and the elevation of saying everything you feel as the highest form of authenticity, all of it runs directly counter to what Solomon observes about the relationship between full venting and foolishness, right? The wise person is not emotionally unavailable. Don't get it twisted, right? Like, they are not hollow or disconnected from what they feel. They have just simply developed the inner depth and the consistent discipline to bring their spirit to a place of quiet rest before they speak, rather than releasing everything that is in them into whatever space happens to be present when the feeling arrives. And that quietness is not emptiness, but it is the strength that does not need to announce itself. It's a kind of restraint that holds more... Sorry, I dropped my mic. It holds more power than the full vent ever could, and it is available to anyone who is willing to do the inner work of cultivating it.